If one heartbeat can save a life, can another heartbeat destroy it? The first time it happened, Ethan Brooks thought he was having a panic attack. 1 second he was alone in his bright Seattle apartment, sunlight spilling across unfinished sketches scattered over his drafting table, and the next his chest tightened so suddenly that he dropped his pencil onto the hardwood floor. His pulse slammed against his ribs with impossible force. His fingers trembled. Every breath felt too shallow, as though the air itself had become thinner. Then came something stranger than fear. A grief so overwhelming that it wasn't his own settled over him without warning. Tears blurred his vision before he even understood why they were falling. Ethan stood abruptly, knocking over his coffee mug. Dark liquid spread across the floor while he pressed a shaking hand against his chest, trying to steady a heartbeat that refused to belong to him. "What is wrong with me?" he whispered to the empty room. The feeling disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind nothing except confusion and a pounding headache. Across the country, nearly 3,000 miles away in Boston, 28-year-old Dr. Noah Carter quietly removed his surgical gloves after losing a patient he had fought to save for hours. Tall, broad-shouldered, with neatly styled dark brown hair, calm blue eyes, and the effortless confidence people trusted without question, Noah had trained himself never to break down inside the hospital. He thanked his exhausted team, stepped into the hallway, and forced himself to breathe normally even as disappointment settled deep inside him. He never noticed the exact second someone else cried with him. Neither of them did. The episodes returned over the following weeks, always without warning and never with any pattern Ethan could understand. Sometimes he woke before sunrise with tears already running down his face despite having no sad dreams to explain them. Other mornings he laughed out loud while making pancakes because a wave of impossible joy burst through him for no reason at all, leaving him smiling at strangers on the sidewalk like he had just won the lottery. His friends blamed stress. His doctor suggested anxiety. Every blood test came back normal. Every skin looked perfect. Noah wasn't doing much better. During quiet nights after long hospital shifts, he would suddenly find his heart racing with excitement while sitting alone in his apartment reading medical journals. Once he found himself smiling so widely that his neighbor asked if he had finally started dating someone. Another evening, while watching the Red Sox on television, his breathing became unsteady for reasons he couldn't explain, his hands trembling as though someone else's fear had slipped beneath his skin. He dismissed it as exhaustion. Doctors weren't supposed to believe in impossible things. Yet impossible things kept happening. Neither Ethan nor Noah realized that somewhere beyond logic, beyond science, beyond every explanation they had ever trusted, another heartbeat had already begun answering their own. The strange episodes slowly stopped feeling random and started feeling personal. Ethan bought a small notebook, not because he believed it would solve anything, but because he needed proof that he was not imagining what kept happening to him. Every time the invisible wave arrived, he wrote down the exact minute, the physical sensation, and whatever emotion followed. Racing heartbeat, sudden relief, unexplained sadness, a quiet sense of hope that seemed to bloom from nowhere. Within 2 weeks, the pages had become crowded with timestamps and questions that no doctor had answered. One rainy Thursday afternoon, while sketching inside a neighborhood coffee shop, Ethan suddenly froze with a smile spreading across his face before he could stop it. It was warm, effortless happiness, the kind that reached his eyes without permission. He looked around the room, embarrassed that he was grinning at complete strangers. Nothing around him had changed. His phone was silent. No email had arrived. Yet for nearly 30 seconds he felt as though someone had just received the best news of their life. The feeling faded as gently as it had appeared, leaving only curiosity behind. Nearly 3,000 miles away, Noah leaned against the nurse's station after hearing that a young patient he had worried about for days was finally healthy enough to return home. The entire staff celebrated quietly, exchanging relieved smiles before returning to work. Noah carried that happiness with him for exactly 34 seconds, never realizing another man across the country had shared every heartbeat of it. Days later, the opposite happened. Noah sat alone in his apartment after another exhausting shift. The silence felt heavier than usual. He stared through the window at the lights reflecting across the Charles River, wondering when his life had become so predictable. Friends kept inviting him out, but he always declined, promising himself that next weekend would be different. As loneliness settled into his chest, Ethan suddenly dropped the grocery bag he had been carrying into his apartment. Apples rolled across the kitchen floor, while tears unexpectedly blurred his vision. He was not thinking about anyone. He had not remembered an old heartbreak. Still, an aching emptiness wrapped around him until he found himself sitting on the floor with no explanation except the impossible certainty that someone, somewhere, desperately wished they were not alone. That night neither man slept well. Ethan searched medical forums until nearly 2 in the morning, reading about stress disorders, rare neurological conditions, and phantom sensations. Noah did the same from Boston, scrolling through research papers that only convinced him how little science could explain about what he was experiencing. Before closing his laptop, Ethan hesitated over a blank search bar, then typed a sentence that felt ridiculous even to himself. Has anyone ever felt another person's emotions without knowing them? Thousands of results appeared, most of them fiction, folklore, or unanswered discussions. One forgotten online journal caught his attention because its title contained only 4 words. Someone else felt this too. Ethan clicked without knowing that one decision was about to pull 2 completely separate lives onto the same path. The website looked as though it had been forgotten years ago. There were no advertisements, no colorful banners, no endless stream of comments competing for attention. Just a plain white background filled with anonymous journal entries, each signed with simple usernames that revealed nothing about the people behind them. Ethan scrolled slowly, expecting stories about anxiety or grief. Instead, he found something that made his heartbeat pause. One post read, "At exactly 7:42 this morning I smiled for no reason while standing in line for coffee. It felt as though someone else's happiness had become mine." Ethan stared at the screen, every hair on his arms rising at once. He opened his notebook and checked the timestamp he had written 3 days earlier. 7:42 in the morning. Sudden joy lasted about 30 seconds. His throat tightened. It could not be a coincidence. He continued reading, his pulse growing faster with every sentence. Another anonymous entry described waking up with tears despite having no nightmare. Another mentioned an overwhelming loneliness that vanished as quickly as it arrived. The details were almost identical to his own notes, but the dates were shifted by hours because of the time difference between the East Coast and the West Coast. Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling while the rain tapped softly against his apartment window. For the first time, he did not feel frightened. He felt understood. Hundreds of miles away, Noah discovered the same website after another restless evening. He had nearly closed the page, convinced it was another collection of fictional stories, until one particular entry caught his attention. "I dropped my coffee today because sadness hit me without warning. I cried before I even knew why." Noah frowned. He remembered that afternoon perfectly. It had been the day he lost a patient despite everyone's best efforts. He had walked out of the hospital carrying a weight he never spoke about, believing no one could possibly understand it. Yet someone had written about experiencing that exact feeling from somewhere else. He reread the post 3 times before quietly closing his laptop. The next morning he opened it again. Ethan spent nearly an hour rewriting his first journal entry before finally pressing publish. He did not describe his appearance, his city, or his profession. Instead, he wrote only what mattered. "Whoever you are, if these feelings are real for you too, I hope you know that you are not carrying them alone." He hesitated over the submit button for several seconds before clicking it. Then he closed the browser, convinced no one would ever answer. 3 days passed. Life returned to its familiar rhythm. Sketches accumulated on Ethan's desk. Noah worked another series of demanding hospital shifts. Neither expected anything to change. Then, just after sunrise on Sunday, Ethan opened the website while eating breakfast. A single new notification appeared beside his journal. Someone had replied. His hands trembled before he even clicked the message. The response contained only one sentence. "I have been searching for you without knowing your name." At almost the exact same moment, Noah sat quietly in his Boston apartment watching a small icon appear beneath his own anonymous profile. For reasons he could not explain, his heart felt lighter than it had in months, as though somewhere beyond maps, beyond distance, and beyond reason, another heartbeat had finally answered his own. Neither of them expected the conversation to continue. Ethan read the single reply again and again, searching for hidden meaning between the words. There was none, only quiet honesty that somehow felt more comforting than any explanation he had heard from doctors or friends. After several minutes, he finally typed a response. "How long have you been feeling this?" He hesitated before pressing send, wondering if he was making a mistake by trusting a complete stranger. The answer arrived later that evening, long enough to stop believing it was a coincidence. Ethan smiled faintly. For the first time in months, someone had described exactly what he had been trying to explain without sounding impossible. In Boston, Noah closed his laptop after sending the message and immediately questioned his decision. He had spent years relying on evidence, measurable facts, and careful observation. Anonymous conversations with someone who claimed to share unexplained emotions did not belong anywhere in his understanding of the world. Yet every instinct told him not to walk away. Over the following days they exchanged short messages, never asking for names, photographs, occupations, or locations. It became an unspoken rule that neither wanted to break too quickly. Instead, they spoke only about what they felt. Ethan described the sudden waves of happiness that arrived while sketching city parks filled with families he had never met. Noah admitted that some evenings he carried home emotions that did not belong to him, feelings so vivid they lingered long after his workday ended. The more they talked, the more impossible patterns began to emerge. Ethan mentioned waking up unusually energized on a Tuesday morning, eager to begin a new painting despite having slept only a few hours. Noah laughed quietly when he read the message because that had been the exact morning he learned one of his most challenging patients was recovering much faster than expected. The joy had stayed with him throughout the day. Somehow Ethan had borrowed every second of it. A few nights later the connection deepened again. Ethan was reading a novel before bed when a wave of quiet determination settled over him. It was not excitement or relief. It was the calm certainty of someone refusing to give up. Curious, he opened the journal website and found a new message waiting. "Today reminded me why I chose my career. I almost forgot that feeling." Ethan stared at the words for several moments before replying. "I think I felt that too." Noah did not answer immediately. Instead, he sat motionless, staring at the glowing screen as a question slowly formed in his mind. What if they were not simply describing similar experiences? What if they were experiencing the exact same moments together? Neither wanted to be the first to say it aloud, perhaps because giving the possibility a name would make it too real to ignore. Then another idea appeared almost naturally. They agreed to conduct a simple experiment. At exactly 8 o'clock Eastern Time the following evening, one of them would focus on a single emotion while the other recorded everything he experienced without looking at any messages until afterward. It was hardly scientific, but it was enough to test whether the impossible connection obeyed any rules at all. As Ethan closed his notebook that night and Noah set an alarm on his phone, both felt the same unfamiliar sensation settling quietly beneath their anticipation. It was hope, shared perfectly between two strangers who were beginning to realize that distance had never separated them as much as they once believed. The following evening arrived with the kind of anticipation neither man wanted to admit aloud. Ethan cleaned the corner of his apartment where he usually sketched, placed his notebook beside him, and watched the clock inch toward 5 o'clock Pacific time. Across the country, Noah finished reviewing patient charts, stepped into the quiet break room, and glanced at the same minute from a different time zone. They had agreed on only one rule. Neither would send a message until afterward. At exactly 8 o'clock Eastern Time, Noah closed his eyes and focused on one memory that had always given him peace. He pictured a clear autumn afternoon from years earlier, walking beside a calm lake with cool air filling his lungs and sunlight reflecting across still water. There were no voices, no pressure, no responsibilities, only quiet gratitude for being alive. Thousands of miles away, Ethan suddenly stopped writing. The tightness in his shoulders disappeared without warning. His breathing slowed. An unfamiliar calm settled over him so completely that he instinctively looked out his apartment window toward the fading evening sky. Nothing around him had changed, yet he felt as though he had stepped into someone else's perfect memory. He quickly wrote down every detail before the feeling could fade. Peace, fresh air, water, gratitude. Lasted almost 1 minute. His pulse remained steady the entire time. Nearly an hour later, they compared notes through the anonymous journal. Ethan described the emotions first without mentioning any images. Noah responded with the memory he had intentionally recalled. They sat staring at their screens in stunned silence. The emotional details matched almost perfectly. Neither could explain how a private memory held inside one person's mind had become a feeling inside another person's heart without sharing a single word. Their experiment continued over the next several days. Sometimes Noah intentionally recalled excitement before a championship baseball game he had attended as a teenager. Ethan would suddenly feel restless energy and an urge to smile. Other times, Ethan focused on the quiet satisfaction he experienced after finishing a painting that truly reflected his imagination. Minutes later, Noah noticed an unexpected sense of accomplishment while organizing paperwork between appointments. The results were never identical in detail, yet the emotional core remained unmistakably connected. Their conversations gradually became longer. They still avoided exchanging names, but they began sharing small pieces of their lives. One enjoyed drawing city skylines at sunrise. The other loved early morning runs before work because the streets were peaceful and empty. One preferred coffee strong enough to wake the entire neighborhood. The other admitted with quiet embarrassment that he could never start a shift without exactly the same kind. They laughed at little coincidences that felt surprisingly meaningful. Without realizing it, both men began checking the journal several times each day, hoping another message would be waiting. Ethan noticed that the apartment felt less lonely whenever the notification icon appeared. Noah caught himself smiling at his phone during lunch breaks, something his coworkers had never seen before. Neither called it friendship. Neither dared call it anything more. Yet every shared message shortened the invisible distance between Seattle and Boston. Then, late one Saturday evening, Ethan opened the journal expecting another thoughtful conversation. Instead, he found only a single question waiting for him. Have you ever wondered whether this connection happened for a reason, or whether we are simply the last two people in the world still willing to listen to a heartbeat that is not entirely our own? The question lingered in Ethan's mind long after he closed his laptop. He tried returning to his sketches, but every line he drew drifted toward the same thought. Was this connection simply an impossible coincidence, or had their lives crossed long before either of them realized it? The following morning, he found himself walking farther than usual through downtown Seattle, carrying a camera instead of a sketchbook. Whenever he needed clarity, he photographed ordinary moments that most people ignored. A child laughing beside a fountain. An elderly couple sharing one umbrella beneath soft rain. Sunlight reflecting from the glass towers onto the sidewalk. Somehow those quiet scenes always reminded him that extraordinary things often hid inside ordinary days. At almost the same hour in Boston, Noah finished an early run along the Charles River. The crisp morning air usually cleared his thoughts, yet today every step brought him back to the anonymous stranger waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. He had spent years believing every mystery could eventually be explained through patience, observation, and evidence. Now he was no longer certain. Their conversations resumed that evening with a new honesty neither of them had planned. Instead of discussing mysterious sensations, they began describing the dreams they had quietly set aside. Ethan admitted that he wanted to illustrate a children's book one day, creating stories that made people believe kindness could still change the world. Noah confessed that becoming a physician had never been about recognition. He simply wanted every frightened patient to feel less alone during difficult moments. As each message appeared, something unexpected happened. The emotional connection remained, but now it carried familiarity instead of confusion. They were no longer sharing isolated feelings. They were beginning to recognize the person behind those feelings. Several days later, Ethan visited a neighborhood bookstore searching for inspiration. While flipping through a collection of landscape photography, a sudden wave of nervous anticipation swept through him. His heartbeat quickened, yet there was no fear attached to it. It felt like standing outside an unopened door, knowing something important waited on the other side. Curious, he checked the journal that evening. Noah had written, only a few lines. Today I almost asked you your name. I stopped myself because I was afraid that knowing too much too soon might somehow change what we have. Ethan smiled before realizing he had been smiling for several seconds. He answered with complete honesty. I almost told you mine today. The reply arrived almost instantly. Then perhaps we are both waiting for the same moment. Days turned into weeks, and their quiet ritual became part of everyday life. Morning greetings appeared before work. Short reflections arrived during lunch. Longer conversations filled the evenings. Neither realized how deeply the other had become woven into ordinary routines until one Thursday passed without a single message. Ethan refreshed the page again and again, finding only silence. Across the country, no one never logged in. As sunset faded over Seattle, an unfamiliar weight settled heavily across Ethan's chest. It was stronger than loneliness and sharper than worry. He could not explain why, but every instinct whispered that somewhere far away, the person who had become the brightest part of his unseen world needed him more than ever before. By midnight, Ethan had refreshed the journal so many times that he no longer noticed he was doing it. The empty screen unsettled him far more than he wanted to admit. During the past several weeks, silence had become something they no longer shared. Even on the busiest days, one of them always found a moment to leave a sentence, a thought, or a simple reassurance that the other was still there. Tonight, there was nothing. He finally closed his laptop and tried to sleep, but an uneasy feeling lingered beneath every breath. It was not fear exactly. It felt more like standing outside a room where someone was calling for help without making a sound. At nearly the same time in Boston, Noah sat alone in a quiet observation room after unexpectedly becoming lightheaded during a demanding shift. His coworkers insisted he rest for a while, convinced that weeks of long hours had finally caught up with him. Noah agreed without arguing, although deep inside he knew exhaustion was only part of the story. Every few minutes, an unfamiliar wave of emotion swept through him, stronger than anything he had experienced before. It was as though another heart kept reaching toward his own, but could not quite find it. The sensation disappeared, returned, and disappeared again, leaving him strangely disoriented. The next morning, Ethan woke before sunrise with an overwhelming urge to open the journal again. There was still no message. Instead, he noticed that the last activity timestamp beneath the anonymous profile had not changed since the previous afternoon. His chest tightened. He tried convincing himself that everyone occasionally took a break from the internet, yet the connection between them had taught him to trust feelings he could not explain. Unable to concentrate on his illustrations, he walked through Seattle carrying only his phone, hoping fresh air would quiet his thoughts. It did not. Every passing hour deepened the same invisible pressure resting inside him. Shortly after noon, the familiar connection surged back without warning. This time it was different. Ethan stopped in the middle of the sidewalk as his heartbeat accelerated. His breathing became shallow, not from panic but from the unmistakable certainty that someone was struggling to remain calm. He leaned against a nearby brick wall until the feeling slowly eased. The instant it faded, he opened the journal and typed the shortest message he had ever written. "Are you all right?" Then he waited. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour before a reply finally appeared. "I am sorry. Yesterday was more difficult than I expected." Ethan exhaled so deeply that he had not realized he had been holding his breath. He answered immediately. "You disappeared, and somehow I felt it." Noah stared at the screen for a long moment before typing his response. "I think we crossed another line yesterday. When I was sitting alone, I could almost sense that someone was searching for me." Ethan read the sentence twice, his pulse steadying for the first time all day. They were no longer sharing isolated emotions that arrived by chance. Somehow they had begun responding to each other's presence itself. The realization should have frightened them. Instead it brought an unexpected sense of peace. Yet neither of them noticed one small detail quietly changing beneath every new conversation. Without planning it, without speaking their names, and without ever seeing each other's faces, they had both stopped imagining a future that did not include the other. The quiet certainty they had built together changed everything. Neither Ethan nor Noah spoke about it directly, yet every message carried a new weight, as though each sentence mattered more than the last. They still respected the invisible boundary they had created, never asking for names or addresses, but the silence around those questions was beginning to feel impossible to ignore. One evening, after finishing another illustration, Ethan looked at the anonymous conversation and realized he could no longer picture the future without wondering who was reading his words. He typed a message, erased it, and typed it again. "Have you ever wondered how far apart we really are?" The reply did not come immediately. Nearly 20 minutes later, Noah answered with unexpected honesty. "Every single day, I have simply been afraid that once we know too much, this might disappear." Ethan leaned back in his chair, surprised that the stranger had confessed the exact fear he had been carrying for weeks. The connection between them had become the safest place either of them had found in a long time, and neither wanted to risk losing it. The following weekend they agreed on something different. Instead of describing emotions after they happened, they would experience the same moment together. They chose sunset, each standing somewhere outdoors in his own city. Ethan walked to Cary Park overlooking the Seattle skyline, carrying his camera over one shoulder. Noah crossed a quiet bridge beside the Charles River just as the evening light settled across the water. Neither could see the other's horizon, yet when the sun began to disappear, the familiar warmth returned all at once. Ethan smiled without realizing it. Noah stopped walking for several seconds, feeling the same quiet wonder. They each looked at different skylines, breathed different air, and listened to different sounds, yet the peaceful gratitude flowing through them was perfectly synchronized. Later that night, they exchanged only a few sentences. "I think we watched the same sunset," Ethan wrote. Noah answered, "Different skies." Same feeling. Those 4 words stayed with Ethan long after he turned off the lights. Days passed, and the conversations became even more personal. They shared favorite books, childhood memories, the music they played during long evenings, and the dreams they had almost given up chasing. Ethan admitted that he often feared his artwork would never reach enough people to matter. Noah confessed that some nights he questioned whether he was doing enough for the people who depended on him. Every confession was met not with advice, but with understanding that neither had ever experienced before. Then, during one late-night exchange, something unexpected happened. Ethan accidentally attached a photograph instead of closing the upload window. Before the image finished loading, he quickly deleted it. A notification appeared seconds later. "I only saw a corner of blue water and part of a sketchbook," Noah wrote. "Do not worry. I closed it before I could see anything else." Ethan stared at the screen, deeply moved by the respect behind that simple choice. Trust, he realized, was growing between them faster than curiosity. Yet after logging off for the night, Noah found himself replaying that brief glimpse again and again. It was not because he wanted answers. It was because, for the first time, the invisible person who had quietly become part of his everyday life suddenly felt astonishingly real. Morning arrived with unusual clarity, as though the unanswered questions that had followed Ethan and Noah for weeks had quietly transformed into certainty. Neither of them wanted to remain anonymous any longer, yet neither wished to rush a moment that had become unexpectedly precious. That evening, Ethan opened the journal first. He stared at the blinking cursor for nearly a minute before writing the simplest message he had ever sent. "I think we have trusted each other for a long time without knowing who we are. Maybe it is finally time." Several minutes later, Noah replied, "I was hoping you would say that first." Ethan laughed softly, feeling the familiar warmth rise inside his chest. It was immediately followed by another emotion that clearly belonged to Noah: relief. They agreed to exchange only their first names. No photographs, no professions, no cities. Just enough to make the invisible connection feel human. Ethan typed his name and pressed send before he could change his mind. Moments later, another message appeared. "My name is Noah." Ethan repeated the name quietly to himself, surprised by how naturally it seemed to fit the voice he had imagined in his mind. Noah smiled at his own screen after reading Ethan's name, realizing that a stranger had suddenly become someone real. Over the following days, they spoke more freely than ever before. They still respected each other's privacy, but the conversations flowed effortlessly. They laughed about favorite childhood movies, compared the weather without mentioning where they lived, and discovered they both preferred quiet mornings over crowded evenings. Their emotional connection remained as steady as ever, but now every shared feeling carried the comfort of familiarity. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan visited a local art exhibition. As he stood studying a peaceful landscape painting, a sudden surge of excitement rushed through him. It felt brighter than anything he had experienced before. Almost instinctively, he checked the journal. Noah had left a message only minutes earlier. "Today I received wonderful news. I cannot explain why, but the first person I wanted to tell was you." Ethan answered with complete honesty. "I think I already knew." Noah stared at those words with quiet amazement. There was no fear left in either of them. Whatever connected their hearts had become part of their lives, not something to escape, but something to cherish. Later that evening, they made one final decision together. Instead of searching for explanations that might never exist, they would simply allow the connection to guide them one step at a time. Someday they would meet. Neither knew when, where, or how. For the first time, the uncertainty no longer frightened them because they trusted the journey more than the destination. Before logging off, Noah wrote one final message for the night. "It is strange. I spent so much time trying to understand why this happened that I almost missed the best part." Ethan smiled as another gentle wave of warmth settled over him, knowing exactly what Noah meant before reading the next sentence. "The best part was never the mystery. It was finding someone who understood my heart before ever shaking my hand." Ethan closed his laptop and looked out at the evening sky, while far across the country Noah did the same beneath another horizon. They could not see each other, yet both smiled at precisely the same moment, their hearts beating with the quiet certainty that some of life's greatest connections do not begin with meeting someone new, but with recognizing a soul that somehow already feels like home.